And I'd like to share some of the insights that we've picked up from the long history of this place, just to sum up some of the things that the Lord has done and to increase our understanding of what He's doing now and what He's going to be doing in the future. As Christians, we're normally not terribly interested in history. For many of us, it was the subject we liked the least in school. We wonder why it's important. But what we must realize in reading the Bible is that God thinks it's important. As a matter of fact, He put huge chunks, if not almost all of the history of Israel, into the Bible. And the major teaching tool, we can say, that He used to teach His whole body in every culture throughout the ages has been the history of one particular people. This should tell us something. I believe that God is interested in history for several reasons. One is that God listens to prayer. And wherever prayers have gone up from any place, God has not forgotten that place. And especially, He has not forgotten those prayers. Those prayers remain even when nothing else visible to the human eye will remain. Along with this is that God is a covenant-keeping God. And when there is prayer that has gone up, and God has made covenant with someone or some group, He keeps the covenant. And He does not forget the covenant, even when it's broken on the other side. God keeps the covenant. Another thing is that God has chosen to work in space and time. This should not be surprising to us because He created space and time. And that means that they're important to Him in the order of things. The physical creation means something to God. And I think it's more important in His eyes than it sometimes is in ours. He works in space and time, and the space that He has created, even the hills and the mountains and the lakes, are important to Him. So when He does something in space and time, it remains there. There's a deposit of God's work there. And the other thing we could say is that He is Lord of the past, the present, and the future, or another way of saying it is that He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He's not Lord just of today, but He's the Lord of the future, and He's the Lord of the whole past. I believe in the sovereignty of God over history and over the affairs of men. And when I say history, I mean present history and future history as well. And if we're convinced of God's sovereignty, we're really convinced that He is Lord of all and Lord over mankind and all the families of the nations, we will be able to see, if we understand the biblical principles and have the leading of the Holy Spirit, we'll be able to see some of the things that God has been doing. So let's go around some of these sites of the old part of Lausanne and remind ourselves of some of the things that He has done, some of the things that He hasn't done in the history of this particular city on this particular mountain. We're here right close to the chateau itself. This is the Chateau Saint-Mer, built in about the 15th century as the key defense anchor of the city of Lausanne. It is a fortress. It was the first residence, actually, of the bishops of Lausanne. And the entire city of Lausanne was just on this little hilltop of what's now, in American terms, we would call it about 3 or 4 small city blocks. But this was the entire center of the city of Lausanne until well into the 17th century, actually, or even later in some ways. But as you can tell, this was a very serious building. These towers are not cardboard or anything. And this defense site actually dictated the choice of this site as the place for the city of Lausanne. Lausanne offered in this place 2 advantages, and they're the common advantages that you find for any city being built before, say, the 18th century: protection and provision. And of course, these are such basic human needs that they're what we pray for even today. But there was a hill here with the land dropping away on every side, which could be easily defended. And if you go over a bit later and look at some of the walls that drop off even now, even after the city's been built up over dozens of centuries, you can see the drop off there. If you walk up some of those hills, you realize that if it's a task for us to walk up, it would be even more difficult to charge up as a soldier with people throwing rocks on your head. So these places were what was chosen. The provision came from the proximity to the trade route, the lake, and the stream, and the forest behind. In archaeological terms, there's an incredible diversity of food resources here, even several thousand years ago. This is a place of God's provision. It has been for many thousands of years, and it continues even to this century. that anointing, I think, is still here. So Lausanne was built on the top of this hill with walls all around, and this chateau was the main place. This square in front of the chateau is one of the main centers for city life early on, and the buildings around it, though modern now, were much more ancient, and up until very recently have housed the main administrative offices of the city of Lausanne. Now, as that has been decentralized into more modern buildings, these buildings, which have been police headquarters and that kind of thing, are being remodeled. Let me just draw your attention to the sundial here on the wall of the chateau. Now, I haven't found out if this is original with the building of the chateau, but it's interesting. It says on it, "Je ne marque que les heures claires," which could be translated, "I only mark the sunny hours." And this is actually, I think, an expression of the spirit of this canton. There's kind of a real interest in recreation, entertainment, taking things easy, and making sure that everything is okay, and not rocking the boat too much. It's the sunny hours in life that really interest us. And this inscription, which is one of the most prominent in the whole city of Lausanne, actually, really sums up the spirit of the place. I'd also like to explain who this man is in the statue. His name is Major Davel, and he's the hero of this canton, the canton of Vaud, V-A-U-D. The canton is of course equivalent to a county, and the Swiss federal structure of many cantons joined together was an inspiration for the American founding fathers, and our system was constructed on that federal system. It's also a current inspiration, some would say, for the unification of Europe in 1992. But anyway, in this canton, the history of it partially is that it was occupied by the oppressive people from Bern for several centuries. How many do we have here from the canton of Bern? I'm just expressing the local point of view. These people with us are not oppressive, really. But this was a minority people that was occupied by a foreign army, an army that spoke another language, a division, by the way, that goes back to pre-Roman times. And when this army came in, this government, there were different attempts during the years to throw off the yoke of this occupying power. And one of these attempts, and one of the more famous ones to remain in the consciousness of the people of this canton, was led by Major Davel in the 18th century. He lost his attempt. He actually had his head cut off, if I remember correctly, down by the lake, down by Ushi. But the statue of him is here, and you can see the angel ready to receive him straight into heaven, although he still has his head there. And he sums up the spirit of independence, which also reigns over this canton. I should point out it's not the only people that celebrate its independence, but I think in many of the public symbols that we can see in a country or in a city or in a place, we can see a reflection of the spirit of the place. And that's one reason I'm kind of sensitive to these kind of things. The motto is summed up in this building behind me, Liberté et Patrie, which is freedom and country. And this still is the motto of the canton of Vaud. And it sums up once again the spirit of the country, Liberté, freedom, and Patrie. And for the Vaudois, for most Swiss, they're actually much more loyal to their canton than they are to the nation, until they get outside the nation. But there is that love of freedom and independence, which of course in all cultures has both its positive and negative aspects. But this whole relationship of Vaud with the canton of Bern has had many implications both for the religious history and as well as the university history of this canton. Okay, well, the Cathedral of Lausanne is one of the best examples, they say, of Gothic architecture in Europe because it was constructed in a very short amount of time. Most of the cathedrals took 2 to 3 centuries to finish. This one was finished in just 1 or 2 generations, which was very fast for the cathedral. And that's why the Gothic is very pure. You can see from the type of the towers, the whole vertical construction of it. If you look at any Gothic architecture, there's so many spires, it just lifts your eyes straight up. It's vertical construction. That's why I say it's meant for worship. Small medieval streets of the city of Lausanne It was in this street, I don't know exactly which building, unfortunately, that Pierre Viret, the pastor of Lausanne, lived. He was the one put in this place by Farel, the main apostle evangelist, and he lived right here. In these streets also, they were just full of university students. When the University of Lausanne really got going and there were hundreds of students, the students were all throughout these streets. They had their meetings and their discussions and their problems and their victories. So the place was crawling with students, church officials, city officials, the market, and the place was really teeming with life. It must have been a very interesting place. As Lausanne has decentralized and the university has moved out just in the last 10 years, 15 years, the central city has been emptied out and it's left a bit of a vacuum. But we can get a little idea of at least what it looked like here in this street. We're standing right here now by the back end, the choir actually, of the Cathedral of Lausanne. You can see as you look up some of the eroded state of the stone with which it was built. So traffic has been limited around it for the last 15 years. Not limited quite enough, but they're trying to preserve it from the pollution. It is over 700 years old, celebrated its 700th anniversary a few years ago with an evangelism campaign, inviting Bishop Festo Kivengera of Uganda to come here and lead a campaign. The pastors the Reformed pastors of this cathedral have a real concern for evangelism. We work with them in their parishes and in their services. And so there's real spiritual life here in this, which is the spiritual center, not only of the city, but of this canton and really of the French part of Switzerland. And it's not every church, even evangelical churches, that celebrate anniversaries with evangelism campaigns. So we're really happy that it's not just history, that the Spirit is moving in this place right at this time as well. Here we are now right in front of the main door of the cathedral. If you go down just a little bit in a couple minutes, you'll be able to see the portico. It's once more an incredible example of Gothic stonework, and some of the statues were left at the time of the Reformation. In some places they were completely destroyed, in others they were left. But here you see most of them, except the central statue, which I haven't read anywhere actually in any of the guidebooks, but I assume it was Mary. This cathedral was called before the Reformation Notre Dame de Lausanne, Our Lady of Lausanne, and there's a chapel inside on the right that was dedicated to Mary. And this was a place of pilgrimage from all over Europe. It was a spiritual center before the Reformation. There were a lot of things going on at the Reformation time, and I don't think anyone has sorted them out. One of the things that was going on that Farel ran up against when he came here and preached the gospel, this red-headed, intense, fiery-tempered French apostle evangelist, when he came in here to start his riots, one reason that they didn't like him here was because the people of Lausanne made their living from catering to the needs of the pilgrims, who needed a place to stay, food, souvenirs, Swiss chocolate, or whatever else they were selling at the time. No, actually chocolate came in later. Came from Latin America. We owe our Swiss chocolate to Latin America. Let's give credit where credit is due. The watches came from France, right? Let's be careful. But anyway, the people of Lausanne did not want to become Reformed. They did not want to become Protestant at first because they would lose their economic livelihood. So it was an economic issue. It was like Ephesus. So they resisted the whole thing, threw Farel out. Well, Farel kept coming back. Along at the same time, though, the Bernese government wanted the people of the canton of Vaud to become Protestant. Now, their motives may have been mixed as well. I don't know if they were that motivated by Matthew 28, because there was a power struggle between Bern and France over this part of Switzerland. And this canton, the canton of Neuchâtel, and Geneva were all in the balance. So the Bernese knew that if these cantons, the French-speaking cantons, who were so attracted to France by their language and culture, if they would separate religiously, that would draw them into Bern's orbit. And this is exactly what happened. The Swiss cut themselves off from the Duke of Savoy, notably, France over here, by turning to Protestantism. So the Bernese had a problem, how to favor the adoption of Protestantism while at the same time they were the hated ruling powers. What they did, as I understand it, although this is a highly emotional topic, as you can imagine, they gave letters of protection to Pharaoh. They used this French evangelist to come and preach the gospel here in Switzerland. Because he was not Bernese, but because he was French, he was listened to much more than a German evangelist would have been. And he was able to come in and preach the gospel, and although there was much initial resistance, it actually finally triumphed. And of course we can understand that Pharaoh was probably happy to preach the gospel by any means possible. The people were going to hear the word of God. One day in 1536, I believe it was, the exact date's on a plaque inside the cathedral here just to the left, just inside the door somewhere, there was a decision by all the voting populace of the city of Lausanne, by which I take it to remain to be the property-owning males. But in the democratic tradition, where only the men can vote, the people unanimously adopted the Reformation. And from one day to the next, this cathedral ceased being Catholic and became Protestant. The stained glass windows were broken out, the idols were torn down, and the clergy was kicked out, the bishop was kicked out, and it became Protestant. There was a real revolution. And because of the teaching ministry of the reformers, the emphasis on literacy and personal morality and that kind of thing, there also came about accompanying social changes, which were even more radical in Geneva because Geneva had gone downhill. But in Lausanne they started to take place as well. As we go into the cathedral, let me draw your attention to a couple of things. Around to the left as you go in the door, there are choir stalls. This is where probably the deacons sat. These are pre-Reformation, carved out of wood. They're works of art that are often lent to museums. So if they're not there today, it's because they're in some museum somewhere. In a cathedral in France, we learned how they did this and how they got their furniture to last several centuries. What they did was they took very high quality oak wood and they would soak it in salt water for 50 years. After that, they would turn it into furniture. This is what we would call long-term planning. And it really struck me as if this is how they plan their furniture for the church, shouldn't maybe we plan ahead a little bit longer term also in our thinking? Another thing that's very interesting, back over to the right where they sell the postcards and guidebooks of the cathedral, at least at this time there is in a glass case a map of Lausanne as it existed in the 17th century, lithograph of an old map. So you can see how small the city was. Even a century, more than a century after the Reformation, it was still a tiny place. At the time of the Reformation, Lausanne had only 4,000 to 5,000 people in it. Geneva as well. So when we talk about these society changing upheavals, we're not talking really about very large numbers of conversions in terms of even what's happening today. The other thing I'd like to draw your attention to, of course, is the Gothic architecture. If you imagine yourself as a worshiper, well, you can even be a worshiper, you don't have to imagine it. But as you're looking at that toward the front of the church and listening to the word and worshiping, you'll notice that the architecture itself just draws your attention straight up. There's a series of 12 to 14 different arches that just draws your attention straight up to heaven. And as you're worshiping the Lord, and particularly, I think, singing Baroque music along with it, it's the music that combines with the architecture which really makes these buildings fantastic for worship. And I'd encourage you as you go inside just to stand back as a worshiper would have done at the time of the Reformation. Of course they didn't have chairs then, but just to let your eye travel up. And I think that has implications for some of church architecture today. The last thing I'd like to mention about the cathedral that you can go see is that clear in the back, the choir it's called, there is a tomb of a soldier with chain mail on, and I think at least one of his arms are broken off, if not two. It's Porto de Grandson, and that's of interest to us in YWAM particularly because that was the first meeting place of the University of Lausanne. When the disciples of Calvin came here to train pastors to take the word into the parts of this area of Switzerland that hadn't heard it yet, they met in that part of the cathedral. They had no building. They went there and they met and they studied right back where the tomb of Porto de Grandson is. So that's the place where the beginning was of the University of Lausanne. So let's take a few minutes and go in and visit the inside. Here we have the tomb of Ortho de Grandson, a great protector of the church. He's here in his armor with his feet on his favorite lion or dog or whatever. But what's interesting is that this is the area where the first students of the University of Lausanne met. This is confirmed to the historians by the fact that on Ortho's robe, the students, not very reverent actually toward Ortho anyway, have put graffiti. So there are even Roman numeral dates and that kind of thing that you can see on his clothing. But this right here behind the altar, which for the reformers was not sacred ground, of course, in this part of the Reformation, this is where the first classes met for the university. Behind me here, the building with the square tower is the building of the University of Lausanne. They first met, as we've said, in the cathedral and then in other temporary places, but very soon the Bernese helped in the construction of a building for the university. So 50 years after the first classes, which were about 1537, in 1587 this building was inaugurated and is still being used for classes at the university. Although most of the faculties have been moved out to the new campus outside of town, and now we have mostly secondary lycée students here. But this big building and this complex of buildings behind me was the University of Lausanne clear until and well into the 20th century. I'd like to move over now and look at this marble plaque that's on the wall of the smaller building down below, if we can move over that way. You remember I was sharing the other night about the time that the edict proclaiming freedom of religion in France was revoked, the Edict of Nantes. And at that time that provoked a huge wave of refugees into not only Switzerland but Holland, England, Germany. A member of my family married a French refugee, and a whole town of French refugees in what is now Germany, east of the Rhine, into South Africa and America. So all these refugees left France and went into the Protestant countries. French churches were established in many cities, and they still remain today. You can visit the French church in Amsterdam where the French refugees established. It's still going on. Still has a French congregation. And one actually non-Christian historian in France has said that France lost its wealth. The entire wealth of that century left the nation. And of course this is consistent with biblical principles as we know it, that when the people of God are persecuted, God is not going to continue to bless. But very practically, they took a lot of their capital with them. Some of the private banks of the city of Geneva were founded from capital that had to flee France at that time. But most of all, it was the population, the hardest working, most moral, upright, solid elements of society were the ones who left. And these refugee families settled all over Switzerland. They settled the whole area of the Jura Mountains because there weren't many people up there. And some of the ones that didn't have the money to start a bank in Geneva started farms up in the Jura. And some of the names that are well known up there, such as Rocha and other names, came as refugees into this part of Switzerland. But as we were sharing the other night, the ones who remained in France, who were still trying to be faithful, did not have pastors. So after the original band of pastors who had stayed there to serve them in spite of being hunted down for slavery by the king's army, as they started getting older and older, people started thinking about passing on the torch, we could say, to the next generation. So how did they do that? They saw that they needed to train pastors. Well, they couldn't train them in a fixed situation there in France. So if you remember, what I said was they set up a system, and a guy named Antoine Court, whose name you read on the plaque, with Benjamin Duplan, they started this school, and their conditions of entry, their DTS, we would call it in Youth of the Mission, was that they would serve in a mobile fashion with an older pastor for a period of a year. They would work up their 3 messages, and they would give them, and they would serve that pastor. He would disciple them and confirm their call. If their call was confirmed, they would pray their way across the Jura Mountains over here, which is the border between France and Switzerland in this part of the country, and pray their way through the armies of the king as well, to Lausanne. They were not, they were treated a bit as outcasts by the university behind them, because the university didn't quite know what to do with them. They were into academic study, Greek philosophy, and here were these young people whose sole burning desire was to go back to their people with the Word of God. And their one desire was not to live here and not to become well-to-do pastors, but it was to go back into that situation of persecution and preach the gospel and minister to those who need it. Well, even though the university would not accept them officially, some of the professors of the University of Lausanne consented to teach here. Now, their curriculum was not that great because they were under such philosophical influence that they also studied mostly Greek and Roman philosophy. However, their commitment was such that they came out of here with, as they went in, with this burning desire to serve intact. And at their graduation ceremony, Antoine Court would give them their diploma and say, "I give you a certificate of death." Because what they did on graduation was not go into some job or some ecclesiastical position, but they would go back into the Church of the Desert, it was called at the time, to serve the Lord there. And as the plaque says, over 400 were trained here in the 18th century, and most of them gave their lives for the gospel in France. And this is an important part of the mantle that we feel that God has put on training for missions in this area of Switzerland, particularly this city of Lausanne, this mountain. It's what happened here in earlier centuries with the original university, but then with this school, and of course what happened also in later centuries. We'll move on down now to the terrace that overlooks the view of Lausanne. We're here on the terrace overlooking the city of Lausanne and the Lac Léman, the biggest lake in Western Europe, by the way. Lake Geneva, it's called in English, but here in the canton of Vaud, we know that Lake Geneva is actually only the little bit down by the canton of Geneva, and the main lake is called Lac Léman. Opposite, we have the mountains of Savoie in France. This lake forms a crescent, a giant crescent, and what some call the oldest road in Europe goes along the north shore of this lake. Why do they say that? It's because Switzerland has always been a crossroads in Europe and has defined much of its history. For example, the Rhine and the Rhone both start in Switzerland. And before the Romans came, even, there was a portage across the mountain between the Rhine and the Rhone. So even the Celts were able to transport goods from the Mediterranean up the Rhone to Geneva, and then do the portage and down the Rhine all the way to the North Sea. And they're still talking about putting a canal between the Rhine and the Rhone to facilitate that passage even today, and now it's an ecological question. But the other reason that it's been very important is that this city of Lausanne and this lake and this area is right on the axis of one of the main invasion routes of Europe. Anyone who wants to invade from Italy, for example, had to come up through those mountain passes. This is why there's the chateau at Chillon near Montreux. It was fortified long before the Romans came, because whoever sat on that rock could control the little road that went along between the lake and the mountain, and in that way control who would come up the lake. Now, Caesar also, Julius Caesar, when he went over to conquer France, he came right along this road down through Geneva, and I think it was 58 BC or something like that, and went on to conquer France. This is where we get the saying, by the way, that Caesar had a lot of gall. And anyone else who wanted to move north into the northern plains of Europe came up and went up this valley here to Avanches on their way to Bern and the plains of the north. And this is why the two main Roman settlements were Nyon, down between Lausanne and Geneva on the lake, and Aventicum, now Avanches, which was up in the valley. They could control whose armies went where. Lausanne had a major port called Vidi, right down at the lower lake. But people believe that Vidi was one of the early settlements, certainly, but the problem with Vidi, although it was right on the lake, is that it offered no protection, which is why probably for thousands of years there has been settlement, human settlement here on this hill. And where I live in Puyi, the little town, the first little town east of Lausanne, there's archaeological proof of 7,000 years of continuous human habitation. And it's certainly the case with the Lausanne area as well, although the archaeology hasn't gone as far due to the urbanization. But right here on this hill was a place that human beings chose to live, to work, to fight for, and to worship. And if the history of Lausanne is anything like the history of Geneva at the time when the gospel first came, which is very probable, there was also a place of human sacrifice. And the place on which the cathedral was built was very probably the site not only of Roman temples, but of Celtic and pre-Celtic altars and places of worship before that. In Geneva, we know that the place where the cathedral was built was a place of human sacrifice. The Roman governor converted in about the 3rd century, and it was at that time that the gospel came into Geneva. The documents don't exist for here, but if it came there, it was probably here because the Romans were here also. I think one question we can ask with a lot of profit, and this is one area that we need university but spirit-guided research on, is what was happening with the Celts, this tribal people who still influence Europe to this day. The Europe of this day still carries the name of the Celtic tribes that were here. The Helvets were the Swiss, the Gauls, the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, the Germans. All these are Celtic tribes who fought the Romans and were conquered. And many of the political and cultural barriers that we see today, even to the language division of Switzerland, go back to which tribe finally ended up where. But God sent Roman armies in to judge these tribes because of their idolatry. It was incredible the things that they did. Human sacrifice by the tens of thousands. On the Celtic battlefields, according to whoever was victorious, they set up huge bowls, and the Celtic priestesses would put to death thousands of people on one day, collecting their blood in huge bowls. They would take hundreds of thousands into slavery on a single day. There was a very good reason that God permitted the Roman armies to come in and to take possession of most of what is now Europe. It was not an accident. I don't believe in accidents at the historical level. At the level of peoples, I believe that God is totally in charge. His sovereignty is over all. What we've been hearing today, even on this terrace, though, is the modernism, the modernization that has come into Europe. As the waves of the gospel have come in, first of all in the very earliest centuries with probably Christian businessmen accompanying the Roman armies, and then the church missionaries coming after them in the 3rd and 4th century, waves of renewal missionaries by the original monastic apostolic teams, then the Christian universities beginning. We are in another phase where the light is dying out in Europe. And even though the church bells still ring in some of the cities of Europe, there's increasing competition with the other sounds of the city. And the primary sound in the historical cities of Europe is not cathedral bells anymore, but as Dr. Glenn Martin says, it's sirens of policemen, ambulances, and also car alarms. Europe is at a point where we need another wave of missionaries to come in. Let me turn your attention now to this other historic building, which is here on my left. This is the former bishopric of the region of Lausanne. In other words, the bishop lived here. He started out in the chateau that we visited at first. Then he had this building built. You'll notice it looks amazingly like a fortress. It was. It was the other fortress, which was the other anchor on this little peninsula, which was shaped like a boat. So The bishop lived here, but it was also a place of defense, and it was the spiritual seat of power here in the city. There's now a museum that's a free museum inside. When it's open, it's under constant remodeling, it seems, and it's been transformed into a place of city offices. Let's look now at the church, which you see down below you toward the lake. It's the Church of Saint Francois. It was a former Franciscan monastery. And it's traditionally the second parish of the city of Lausanne. The cathedral is the first parish, Saint Francois is the second. It's very different if you visit it and you're in tune with the Lord as you visit these different churches. There are symbols of death in there. There's skulls and crossbones. There's just a darkness that you don't feel in the spirit as you visit the Cathedral of Lausanne. And it's reflected in the modern day ministry of the place. I don't know the history in detail, but I do know that the spiritual cleaning out and re-establishment of the Lord's work has not taken place in Saint Francois as it has here in the Cathedral of Lausanne. Saint Francois, though, is the main site of our Greek temples here in Lausanne. By Greek temples, I mean the principal Swiss banks, which all have Greek porticos and marble columns. And it is also a very important spiritual center of the city, and one which needs warfare. We're going to stop here now at the old city and walk down the old steps, the old market steps, the covered steps that allowed people who lived up here to go down to the lower market at the end of the 16th and the 17th century. If you look down behind me to this little door set in the wall here in the old city stairs, there's a very plain little room there which is so damp that if you go in there for any time you have to scrape the water off the walls. But in the 1960s, we're not talking ancient history anymore, some of you may even remember those days. In the late 60s and early 70s there was an incredible youth revival in here, and it was an encouragement to us that the mantle of the Lord for evangelism is still here. There are a number of young couples who decided to open it up as a kind of a coffee bar to young people. And the university students who were still here at the time but not moved out to the new campus, many of them came here and got saved, many of the high school students. This place was full every night with Christians and non-Christians discussing and arguing, and some of them getting saved. So it was a sign to us that the Lord wants to do something again in the center of the city. So we'd appreciate your prayer with us that another coffee bar type situation could open up that we could use permanently. I'll meet you at the bottom of the stairs. Behind me we have the Place de la Palue. This is the real lively square of the city of Lausanne, and has been for many centuries. The building you see behind me, once again with the square tower is a mark of the Bernese architecture, is the town hall, and it was built as the town hall. And it's still where the mayor has his office, and it's really the main civic center of the city of Lausanne. Let's just move down here to the Place and try to feel the heartbeat a little bit of the city. Here we are now in front of the main fountain here. You can see the date on it. You notice on top of the fountain we have Justice. She's blind and she holds the sword and the scales. This is because the courts of Lausanne were also here. As I mentioned, this place is really the heart of the city. The main shopping district is down the two streets at either end of the square. Some of the more interesting shops, bookstores, and that kind of thing. This is also a very good place for evangelism. This is where the crowds are. Anytime there are people in Lausanne, there are going to be people here. YWAM has done street evangelism. We were actually not the first, because as you may remember when I was talking about the first students of the first University of Lausanne, when they did street evangelism, this was the place they came to. This was the market square. And when they wrote their street drama, when their professor wrote the street drama, Abraham Sacrificing, this is the place they came and performed it, right here. And it's easy to gather a crowd here. Well, let me say relatively easy, because the people do not stop easily But if you have something that's very interesting, such as African praise or something like that, mime, people will stop and listen. I think this place still has a great deal of spiritual significance. In the early 80s, there was a Christian coffee bar here which had much fruit. Then the ministry had to move out because the building was sold. But now still the Christian bookstore in town is right up the little street behind us. There's also the main Christian counseling ministry. It's right here. They wanted to be in a place where people could walk off the street and get Christian counseling. So they prayed for a place right here and got it. Now what we also have is not just young people congregating here who are willing to sit and talk, but we have the Scientologists and the Hare Krishna who are coming in here again. After their strong times in the early 70s, they're coming back in, and I believe filling a spiritual vacuum. So we're praying for this Christian coffee bar that it would be in a place like this. But we also believe we need to take new steps in prayer and spiritual warfare and occupy these places in the Spirit. So here we're coming to the end of the kind of historical tour of Lausanne. I'd encourage you, if you want to get to know this city a little better, to walk along these streets. As I mentioned, the main stores are along here. But as you walk, please be open to pray that the Lord would work again. The motto of the city of Geneva is Post Tenebras Lux, out of the darkness light. And this, of course, could be the motto of whatever the Lord has done in history. Out of the darkness, the Lord creates light. Several times in the history of Geneva and in the history of Lausanne, the Lord has done exactly that. But we need to do Him at the end of the 1980s. We need Him to do it one more time. Out of the darkness, light.